A trio of duck hunters found out the hard way to always wear a life vest when you go bird hunting in a boat, especially in the frigid waters of a Minnesota lake. That's right, folks. This story comes to us from another northerner, although it's south of here. That's for sure. Us Canadians would figure it a southerner. But as far as the United States goes, Minnesota's up there in the north, and they get some darn cold weather as well. I'm Spencer Rimple, the Moose Whisperer, bringing you exciting hunting and outdoor adventure stories from around the world. Stick with this one, folks. It's a harrowing experience of someone who, well, just about lost their lives there in Minnesota, down in the United States. So let's start our story right now. Minnesota is a state known as the land of 10,000 lakes. And actually, that's a little bit of an understatement. The reality is that Minnesota boasts 14,000 lakes scattered across its open prairie and deciduous forests. And that's not counting the lakes that are shared across the Canadian border or with other states. When thinking of Minnesota, most probably think of the Twin Cities, the massive Minneapolis or St. Paul. That's home to 3/5 of the population of the entire state. So far few think of the vast woodlands that make this state heaven for an outdoorsman. Now, every September, one of the most popular recreational outdoor activities in Minnesota is waterfowl hunting for ducks and geese. Since there is no shortage of lakes in Minnesota, there is also no shortage of locations to go waterfowl hunting. While many hunt ducks and geese from shore near bodies of water, many others embark on boats to take shots at the elusive birds from out in the middle of the lake. All right, now, while hunting in a boat is certainly a major thrill, it also brings with it significant risks. The state of Minnesota mandates that waterfowlers have life jackets in their vessels at all times, with at least one life jacket per passenger. Now, unfortunately, these legal requirements only go so far in actually ensuring safety. Many hunters will bring life jackets into their boats, but will not actually wear them. I can kind of understand, while you're hunting, life jacket can be bulky and cumbersome. It can get in the way and it can disrupt the process of bringing your shotgun to your shoulder to take a shot at the birds. All right, but that said, they can still work wonders to save your life should you fall into the frigid waters. And let's make no mistake, the lake temperatures in late fall in this area are around 42 degrees Fahrenheit or 6 degrees Celsius. Now that's cold. Even if you're confident in your swimming abilities, the weight of your shotgun and other hunting equipment can weigh you down and make your survival efforts more difficult. That's also not to mention that in the fall and winter months, especially in the lakes of Minnesota, well, they can become exceptionally frigid and result in hyperthermia very fast should you fall in. All right, the winters of Minnesota are already known for being exceptionally long and brutal, meaning the cold can set in during the fall hunting months when waterfowlers are out on the lakes. The possibility of falling into an ice-cold lake is one of the biggest risks that waterfowler hunters who hunt from boats face. This is precisely what one hunter named Dan found out in the fall of 1984. In September 1984, 3 Minnesota hunting buddies by the names of John, Eric, and Dan went out duck hunting on Lake Popowski. With them was John's Brittany Spaniel dog named Brandy. Lake Popowski has long been popular with waterfowl hunters and is located in northern Minnesota. The lake consists of a large island and a smaller island, both of which are frequented by duck hunters. Like most other lakes in Minnesota, the lake gets very cold during the fall and winter months. When the three arrived at the lake early in the morning, it was a chilly day, as chilly as any other. Loading up into John's duck boat, which measured around 12 feet in length, the 3 hunters set out onto the east side of the lake towards the big island in the middle. There were other duck hunters present in the south side of the big island as well. Unfortunately, the trio would soon make a few misguided decisions, and they would pay the price for it very soon. Most notably, they made perhaps the biggest duck hunter boating mistake. While they had enough life jackets in the boat to satisfy Minnesota's legal requirements, they weren't wearing them. The 3 unloaded on the east side of the island to look for ducks with Brandy still tied in the boat so she wouldn't run off along the beach. They spotted a duck that took off from the island and flew about 200 yards away before descending back into the water. Unable to get a shot off from the island, Dan opted to take off after the duck in the boat with his shotgun. John and Eric remained back on the island. Now, Dan departed from the island in the boat, but the vessel was not balancing well in the water with him in the back. He also wasn't wearing a life jacket. Brandy was still tied to the inside of the boat as well, up in the bow. While Dan was searching for the duck with the boat, with John and Eric still on shore, the boat suddenly flipped over onto the water. Well, on instinct, Dan reached over to grab Brandy as they both plunged into the freezing water. All of the life jackets blew away in the wind and settled on the water far, far out of Dan's reach. Further complicating matters was the fact that the vessel was an older hunting boat that lacked level flotation. The boat was hardly afloat after it tipped over, with only the upside-down front tip above the water level. The motor of the boat was weighing down the back end deep into the water. Dan tried to stabilize himself over the boat, but only found that it would just sink down even more. Meanwhile, he was also trying to grab Brandy, who was trapped underneath the boat, thrashing. Well, John and Eric were witnessing this from the shoreline. Eric froze up while John immediately started running down the south side of the island to get to the other hunters about half a mile away. But his heart sank because he saw the other hunters. They were in their boat and heading the other direction. He quickly fired multiple rounds from his shotgun into the air, but that didn't even gain their attention as they were far gone and nobody was looking and nobody could hear. Frantically, he spun back around and ran up the north side of the island about a mile long. Along the way, he passed Eric, who was sitting on a bench and sobbing uncontrollably. Realizing that no other hunters were present on the island, John knew that he had to take matters into his own hands to save Dan. Peering across the narrows on the north end of the island, he saw a farmhouse on the mainland. John dove into the water and started swimming across the lake with his hunting clothes on. But he couldn't make it because the clothes and equipment on him were too heavy. He quickly returned to shore, disrobed down to his underwear, and then tried again. He was already shivering horribly from the freezing water at this point and knew that hypothermia was likely to set in if he tried this again. But he also knew that his friend Dan was in a far worse condition back at the boat. So John dove back into the lake and swam all the way to the shoreline of the mainland. With any luck, he thought, I'll make it to the mainland and the farmhouse before the hypothermia sets in. And with a little bit more luck after that, I'll find a boat and I'll get back and I'll get out there to rescue Dan. Well, Dan was desperately treading water. He was shivering violently from the freezing water, and his hefty hunting clothes were making it difficult for him to stay afloat. Brandy had gone still and silent, having tragically drowned in the water underneath the boat. Dan was on his own, and that wasn't a good feeling. To reduce the weight on the boat, Dan decided to remove the motor off the end of the transom, or the stern of the boat. Now, to accomplish this, he would have to dive underneath and get to the latches where he could unscrew them to try and free the heavy motor from the boat. Slowly freezing to death, he knew he had to do something. So, still shivering violently as hypothermia was setting in, Dan finally managed to get the motor loose after multiple attempts. The motor loosened free from the transom and sank into the lake as the boat finally started to move up more towards the surface. But then the safety chain of the motor caught on the boat. With the motor sinking fast, it dragged the boat down another 14 inches deeper into the water, worsening the situation further. Dan now knew that the situation was hopeless. He couldn't swim back to shore, he couldn't float over the boat, and hypothermia was setting in hard. The blood left his extremities. The inner warmth began to deplete from his core. He was already shaking and shivering violently, and now it became even worse to the point that he couldn't even think because he'd lost all focus. Just as Dan was about to accept his apparent fate, he thought about how his parents would take the loss of a son, and he prayed for more time. With what little mental strength he had left, he prayed that he would be a good person to his friends and family. And for the rest of his life, if only he could just have more time. Just then, believe it or not, the boat popped back up to the surface. The motor's safety chain had somehow slipped off of the boat, permitting the boat to levitate back to the surface of the water. Then, the faint sounds of a boat motor steadily getting louder and louder reached Dan's ears. He looked over at the sound and saw another boat with John, albeit very wet and in his underwear, coming towards him. As Dan realized his desperate prayers had been answered, he blacked out. When Dan came to regain consciousness, he was wrapped in a blanket in front of a warm oven. John and Eric were there with him. John explained what had happened. He made it across the Narrows on the north end of the lake, ran up to the farm, and found a boat with a trailer in the barn. He plugged the boat drain hole with a rag and then pulled the trailer to the shoreline with his brute strength. Launching the boat, he got the motor started and immediately set out to Dan's position. Rescuing him just in the nick of time, he pulled him his unconscious from the water. Now, the older couple who owned the farm returned around that time, just as John was finishing the story, and they were shocked at what they saw, but assisted the hunters at getting Dan back into town to start his recovery. Well, the biggest lesson from this harrowing true story of survival is to have a never quit attitude when you find yourself in a survival situation. Both Dan and John refused to quit no matter the odds. Despite being plunged into the frigid waters, Dan stayed calm and did everything he could to get the boat afloat so he wouldn't drown, and he held on until help came. Had the boat not stayed fully afloat, Dan would have expended more energy trying to swim and likely would have drowned. John never stopped until he found a solution to help his friend. He ran all over the island to search for help, and when there was none, he swam across the freezing waters to find help. And when he still couldn't find help then, he took matters into his own hands, located the boat, and dragged it all the way back to the shoreline before setting out to rescue Dan. Just think, John could have stopped when he didn't find them on the island, when he needed to swim across the Narrows to the shoreline, or when he needed to drag the extra boat back to the shoreline. Any one of these would have stopped an individual who had lesser inner fortitude. But it didn't stop John, because he was bound and determined to do anything possible to rescue his friend. This stood in contrast to Eric, who did exactly what you shouldn't do in a life or death survival situation, and froze up and broke down sobbing on the shoreline, while John was out finding and dragging the extra boat back. Neither John nor Dan gave up. John never gave up on rescuing his friend, and Dan never gave up on staying alive. And that is the driving force that is sure Dan made it out alive.